Today I'm going to tell you about what's in chapter 3 of my new book. And the chapter 3 is entitled The Second Metamorphosis. That refers to the second one that I went through in my journey through this scientific endeavor. And so I left everybody in chapter 2, at the end of chapter 2, and we just gotten home from France on the SS France, docked in New York. We rented a car and drove up to New Hampshire. It's about a 5-hour drive from New York City. As we got further and further north, there were fewer and fewer cars, fewer and fewer people. You know, they just have bears and raccoons up there, as far as I can tell. The change from first Paris and the hurly-burly city of Paris and then New York City to get into this quietness that was taking us over, enveloping us actually. It was surreal. But we finally made it up there and we reoccupied our house. We had, as I said in the last video, we bought a house up there. We rented it while we were gone. So we reoccupied our house and everybody was ecstatic, including myself. I was pretty happy to be back too. And certainly Lynn was, and our 2 boys, that they could now run around the yard and so forth and so on. And Carrie at this time was just ready for first grade. And so we enrolled him, and this was August when we came home. So first thing he was exposed to was from the French school to the American school. He seemed to be pretty well set, and our younger son was not ready for elementary school yet. So we put him into a preschool in Hanover, and he was happy there. And so that was good. The first thing I did when we got home to Hanover was sit down and write some grants. Because I finally had woken up to the fact that if I didn't have my own money, I was not going to be able to be self-determining in terms of what I actually did in the laboratory. I would just be basically a pawn of somebody else. And like I said, I was really anxious to set up my own operation and be my own boss and do my own thing. It's sort of the story of my life, probably. And so I wrote 2 grants. And the first grant I wrote was about the project that I had done in Paris with Tord Fredrickson, which was about erythropoietin, which is, as you recall, is that hormone that drives red blood cell production in the body. And the thing is that just like all the rest of the lymphokine or the lymphocyte molecules or activities that had been, poorly described and so forth, they were all activities detected by bioassays, but they weren't really substances. They weren't molecules. You couldn't put it in a bottle and say, okay, this is it. And so that was the first order of business. And because of the fact that we had worked on a new assay for erythropoietin that was very rapid and very quantitative, and it was a microassay amenable to a whole bunch of samples run all at once. And so I figured it was a no-brainer. And the second grant that I wrote was for the tumor immunology project that I had sort of dreamed up over the course of the past 2 or 3 years, actually. Because as time went on, I realized that in terms of tumors and cancers, people talked about, wouldn't it be great if there was an immune response and the immune system could just get rid of the cancer, just like it does with microbes and so forth. Problem was when people looked for an immune reaction in the cancer patients, they couldn't find any antibodies in the plasma, which was really about the only way you could really look for an immune reaction to something. So they looked and looked and looked. Nobody found any antibodies. And I said, well, maybe at this time it was just at the beginning, really, of T-cell biology. And I thought to myself, well, maybe the T-cell immune response will recognize the cancer cells. And so I thought that what I could do was to borrow some of the methods and the thinking from Professor Mattei, who had worked first on mouse model systems and then transferred that to the human. I thought, well, that seemed like a reasonable thing to do, because it's very difficult to do experiments in humans, especially sick humans. They've got cancer and so forth, and each one of them is different. And so it seemed to me that the best thing to do would be to stick with the basics, try to work out a system in the mouse, and see if you could immunize mice against leukemia or tumor cells. And that's an advantage, because in the human situation, you couldn't immunize a person with cancer cells before they had their cancer, and you couldn't use necessarily somebody else's cancer cells and you immunize the person and so forth. But you could do that in the mouse, and so the mouse seemed like the place to start in this whole process. And some other people had done a little similar. They were more working towards that, but they hadn't really done what I wanted to do. And so what I wanted to do, and this is what I laid out in this grant request, was that I would first take mice, and I would take leukemia cells from that mouse strain as well as other mice strains, and irradiate the leukemia cells and inject them into the mouse, and do that repetitively. So you give them booster injections and so forth, and try to hop them up as much as you possibly could. And then at the end of a month or 2 or 3 of this kind of treatment of these mice, then you could take their spleen cells and their lymph node cells out and put them into culture, again, with the same leukemia cells or even different leukemia cells that we started with the hypothesis that the leukemia cells that we were using would share antigens. And there were reason to suspect that that would be the case, that if you stuck to a particular kind of leukemia, then you could demonstrate that they had cross-reactivity among one leukemia cell line and another leukemia cell line. So I proposed to do all this, and then it was time to get down to brass tacks and do some actual experiments in the laboratory. And I felt, I felt on the one hand that coming back from, after I'd been to the NIH, and I'd been to France, and I've also been at Dartmouth for a year, I figured I'd been into 3 different laboratories. I knew basically what the game was what was going on in the biz in these several different laboratories. And I watched different people design experiments and do experiments and so forth. So I in medicine, they have a saying is that you watch one, you do one, and you teach one. And so I was basically under that whole rubric, that I didn't need much more teaching from my mentors, and I wanted to go ahead and do it myself. And I figured that, in Dartmouth was really sort of a backwater in terms of immunology. Although it was an Ivy League college, the medical school was very small. It was only a 2-year medical school. And after they educated the first 2 years, they sent their people off to other hospitals to do the clinical training. So it wasn't a big, thriving research institution at the time. But I figured that this was the best for me because of the fact that I had watched people go about their business, and it seemed to me that a lot of the young people that were in these laboratories that I came across and so forth, they really didn't have a clue about what they should be working on, except for a general area like cancer or whatever. They didn't know what to do though. And what I found a lot of them doing was that they'd come into the lab and shoot the breeze and have a cup of coffee and whatever, and say, well, what are you doing today? So what are you working on? And so you'd tell them, and then they'd run back to their lab to see if they could do it faster than you were doing. That didn't seem to me like a good recipe for success in this whole process. And so I sort of took a phrase from the song New York, New York. And I figured if I could make it in Hanover, New Hampshire at Dartmouth Medical School, I could make it anywhere. And so that's the cross that I set up in front of me to see whether or not I could really play this game. And the other thing that influenced me, though, was a book that was published by Peter Medawar, who was a Nobel Prize winner in immunology in 1960. And he published a book called The Advice to a Young Scientist. And there are a lot of pearls in this book. And I read it very carefully and thought about it, paid attention to it. And one of the things he said early on in the book, he said, if you want to be successful in science, you have to work on something you have to work on something important. So I thought, well, that seems obvious, but I said, so what's important, and who decides what's important? Well, ultimately, I figured that working on the question of trying to bring a new therapy for cancer was important. 25% of the population dies of cancer, and they still do. That was, back 50 plus years ago. And so that's why I chose the different projects that I did. And the other thing that I figured in the same vein was you really have to, you can't just follow the maddening crowd and do what everybody else is doing if you want to be successful. If you do that, you're going to lose because you're just starting out. You're working against, big machines of laboratories with 25, 30 people working on these kinds of things with some really famous professor, the head of the laboratory, who travels all over the world and talks about all the things his wonderful lab is doing and that sort of thing. And so that, you see, worked to my advantage being up at Dartmouth, because what happened ultimately, and I'm moving ahead of the story a little bit, but basically for the first 5 years that I was up at Dartmouth, nobody had ever heard of me. Now, who's Kendall Smith, And so they didn't pay attention to me. And so I was basically left to my own devices, and I knew what I wanted to do, and I knew how I wanted to do it. And so I just did it, essentially. And so the first thing I did was to get this lab off the ground was that I hired a new technician for the laboratory, because McIntyre, my boss, I was really being financed by his grant that he'd gotten funded while I was in France. So I hired a technician whose name was Mary Firm, and her father actually was a biology professor at Dartmouth. And she had just graduated from Oberlin College. And they say, and Oberlin College was my father's alma mater. And if I heard my mother say it once, she said it 1,000 times. She said, your father was a Phi Beta Kappa, so what are you going to do? And Mary was a Phi Beta Kappa. And I said to myself, well, that's the next best thing, So I hired Mary, and she turned out to be fabulous. And so, she's really a quick study. I didn't have to explain anything more than once or twice to her. And she just picked it up like it was second nature. And we set up the assays that I had learned how to do in France, the Erythropoietin assay and the mixed tumor lymphocyte cultures. And we got the leukemia cells in, and we started growing them and so forth. And early on in the first year I was back, 74, 75, around in there, McIntyre invited a fellow from the NCI, Bob Gallo, to come up to Dartmouth and give a seminar. And the seminar was really very interesting. And Gallo himself as a person was very charismatic and stimulating. In some respects, he reminds me, though, in some respect, he reminds me of Trump a little bit, and so forth. So he told this story that was really almost like Star Wars or Star Trek, because it was sort of way out there. What he was trying to do was generate leukemia cells from different leukemia patients to grow in tissue culture, so that he could then grow large numbers of cells and extract from those cells what he thought was causing the leukemia, which was a cancer virus. Now, the thing is at that time, over the 50s and in the 60s, viruses had been found in many different kinds of cancers in animals. First in mice, and then in chickens, or first in chickens, and then in mice, and then in cats, and in rats, and in dogs, and cattle, and monkeys, and even the gibbon ape, which is very, because it's an ape, it's very close evolutionarily with humans. So he figured that there had to be a human cancer virus. So the story he told in his seminar was that they had established some leukemia cell lines from leukemia patients with the help of a leukemia-specific growth factor that they had found screening through a whole bunch of different cell cultures. They'd found one particular cell culture that they said was from a human embryo that was making a growth factor that would allow these leukemia cells to proliferate. And then they grew up large numbers, and they had all these molecular virologists working in the place. And they extracted what they thought was a new human cancer virus. And he called that HL23, human leukemia number 23. And so after his seminar, we went out to dinner at the Hanover Inn, McIntyre and myself and Bob Gallo. And so then I told him what I was trying to do, which was to generate killer T cells from patients, or from patients to kill the leukemia cells. So I asked him whether or not this patient was still alive that established the cell line from. And he said, yeah, he's down at MD Anderson. And so then I told him, well, let's collaborate, and I'll come down to Bethesda and I'll see if I can generate killer T cells reactive from the patient's lymphocytes against his own leukemia cell lines that you have. So he thought that was a great idea. He invited me down, and so it took me a while to get everything organized and get the family to agree to this and so forth. And so what I did is I loaded up I had a little Fiat Spider that I had bought, and I loaded up the front seat next to me. There wasn't much room in the trunk, with all my equipment, and drove down to Bethesda. And I spent 2 or 3 months down there. I stayed with my aunt and uncle who live in Northwest Washington, so that wasn't a major problem. And the thing is that when I got there, they said, bummer. The cell line that was making our leukemia growth factor, we've lost it. And there was a big freezer accident where all the cells that were in the freezer thawed, and we don't have any more of the cells making the leukemia growth factor. They still had some cells growing though, and I looked at them and they looked like leukemia cells to me. And so I had enough time, or I had enough reagents to go. They sent up the lymphocytes. I did the mixed tumor lymphocyte culture, and I did the cytotoxicity assay and so forth. But I can't even remember. It must have had to have been negative. Anyway, soon that was over with, and so that was the cloud that hung over me. But like every cloud, there was a silver lining, and that was that I met a whole bunch of people down in Gallo's lab, 2 of which were very, very important for what followed next in the next few years, actually. One was a person by the name of Doris Morgan, and she was a postdoc that had been hired by Gallo from the MD Anderson to work on this leukemia growth factor and so forth. And she was an interesting person because she was just perfect for cell culture work, because she was very serious, very thorough, very meticulous, and she didn't screw around. And so that was good. The other person that I met down there was a fellow by the name of Frank Rossetti. Now, Frank was this Italian, second generation Italian immigrant who grew up in South Boston, and he was a stocky guy. Some people described him as a fire plug, and he was pretty solid. You don't screw around with Frank either, But it was funny because he talked a mile a minute. He was always talking all the time, and prodding me and all this other stuff. We became good friends, and that was also very, very good. So, the thing about what I've learned about science over the years now is that, so I went back, I left Bethesda, I came back to Hanover and kept up where I left off, picked up where I left off. And then we got word that the EPO grant, the Erythropoietin grant, was not going to be funded. So that was another bummer. And I said to myself, or whatever, I've written about it in the book so that when you read the book, you can get all the details from that whole thing. But I figured these NIH peer review groups didn't, they didn't know what they were doing. That's what I decided. So the thing was, the good news was the other grant was funded, the one on tumor immunology. And so I've been told by some people that the science is like big game hunting. You eat what you kill. So we did get the tumor immunology grant, and so I became a tumor immunologist by default, actually, rather than a hematologist, where I'd been essentially clinically trained the whole time, and hadn't been really trained in any clinical immunology sense to speak of. So when the tumor immunology grant was funded, and then suddenly I had a large influx of money because I had McIntyre's grant to work from, and I had now my own grant to work from. So I hired 2 more techs and then started training them, and Mary and I would train them and so forth and get them into the system, which required a lot of very careful, intense personal interaction with all these people, because you had to train them to do things. You couldn't expect them to just sort of pick up the pipe, know which end of the pipette to put in their mouth, And so, so soon thereafter, along in that time period, a grad student came over from the biology department of Dartmouth College, and he was looking for a lab to do his thesis in, and his name is Steve Gillis, and so he joined the lab. And then soon after that, a postdoc came from Tord Fredrickson's group down at the University of Connecticut, and that was Paul Baker, and he joined. And so that was the initial team, about 4, 5, 6 people that were, focused on these issues. And within the next several months to a year, we really did demonstrate that you could immunize mice with leukemia cells, and you could activate them in vitro and boost them up by an in vitro activation with the mixed tumor lymphocyte culture. And that really was our very first paper that was published in the Journal of Experimental Medicine, which was a very prestigious immunology journal at the time, still is. And so that was good. Now, meanwhile, while all of this was going on, I decided that what we really needed to do was one thing to be able to do, with these leukemia cells that we were using, but we knew that they had been started by leukemia viruses, and so that the virus itself could possibly be what the immune reaction was reacting to, not necessarily the tumor. And of course, human leukemia cells weren't making any virus, and so they were what the virologist would call a non-producer. So I figured, well, we need non-producer leukemia cells to work on, and so I started, things in the process to find those. But I also needed assays for the virus to be able to prove to the reviewers and everybody else that these cells did make virus or they did not make virus. And so I went down over the course of a year to Bethesda again, to different laboratories, and looked over their shoulder and to try to learn how they did their assays. And then once I thought I had them together, I brought them back to Hanover, and I set them up in the laboratory, and then I would train one of the technicians to do that particular assay. And so, in other words, I didn't really need to be at the NIH. I just needed to transfer everything from the NIH up to Dartmouth. So that's what I did. Now, along the beginning of 1976, I got a call from Frank Rossetti. And he said, Kendall, you know, it looks like we can do something very interesting down here that you might be interested in. And that is that it looks like we can grow T cells in culture for a long time, weeks. Now that was phenomenal because of the fact that T cells only grew for 2 or 3 days, and then they would peter out and then they would die. And he said, in order to do that, what's happened is Doris Morgan has done all this work, and she's shown that if she uses medium that had been taken from growing lymphocytes, stimulated with mitogens like PHA and so forth, she takes that culture medium and she seeds human bone marrow, because she's been trying to culture leukemia cells, because that's why she was hired by Gallo. That, you know, she got cells to grow, but they didn't look like leukemia cells. They looked like lymphocytes. And they started to do some crude, or the assays that you could do at the time, to define whether they were T cells or whether they were B cells or what they were, myeloid cells and so forth. And they looked like they might be T cells. And so the reason he contacted me was because they wanted to see whether or not they could show that these T cells would make other cytokines, other lymphokines, and one of them would be interferon. And he knew that I had, or McIntyre's lab had an interferon assay going routinely around the clock. So he proposed to do a collaboration where he'd send up samples from his different cultures to me, coded. So I didn't know, they were blind, so I didn't know what they were. We put them in the interferon assay, and lo and behold, it was only his stimulated T cell cultures, or hers, Doris Morgan's, that made interferon, but they clearly made interferon. And so we told him that, and so forth. And then I said to him, you know, while we were doing these experiments, I said, you know, Frank, I've been thinking about this factor that you guys have that grows T cells, and I think that's really interesting, because, you know, we've been able to generate these cytotoxic T cells that kill leukemia, and I'd like to be able to grow them long term and grow up huge numbers of them, because then we might be able to use them for therapy, God knows what. And we'd be able to find out all kinds of things about T cells. And so he said, and so he told me how to make the factor. We called it Frankie's factor, even though it wasn't Frankie's factor, but it seemed like a nice, rolled off your tongue, you know. And so we started making Frankie's factor, but we switched everything into the mouse, because our mouse, we could generate cytotoxic T cells in the mouse. And so we wanted to grow mouse cells. And we didn't know it at the time, but it turns out that the factors are species specific by and large. Human factors will work on mouse cells, but mouse cells won't work on human cells. And that's what we found out subsequently. And the thing was, a factor that would cause lymphocytes to proliferate, particularly T cells, had been known for a decade already. In 1965, there were two papers that came out in Nature, back to back, from two groups from McGill University in Montreal, and one from surgery and another from, I think, pathology, but different papers and different authors and so forth. And I got to be good friends with one of the authors, whose name was Shinpei Kasakura, and he was from Japan. And I went over and met him and spent some time with him, and really liked him. He was a great guy. He's a good scientist. But that was 65. After 65, not a whole lot happened until 1970. And then from between 70 and 75, there were more and more papers that were being published about a bunch of different T cell factors. And everybody named them a different name. You know, there was T cell activating factor and T cell stimulating factor, and lymphocyte activating factor, and so forth. Nobody really knew, you know, a factor is basically a no term, because it doesn't tell you whether it's a molecule or whatever, it's an activity. But anyway, there was precedence for this whole thing, that factors had something to do with making T cells grow. Whereas the dogma in immunology up until that time had been that the only thing that will make T cells begin to proliferate, because when they're circulating in your blood and in your body, they are small round cells that are very quiescent, and up until that time, nobody really knew what they did or how they did what they did. Nobody thought that they discovered in the 60s that antigens and mitogens being like PHA, would cause a short-term burst of proliferation in the T cells. So we decided to generate cytotoxic T cells by in vivo and then in vitro immunization, and then taking the cells, assaying them for cytotoxicity, and then putting them into this Frankie's factor. And I didn't think it was going to work. I didn't know one way or the other, but I wasn't all excited about this particular experiment because I just didn't think it was going to work because of the dogma. I guess that's another lesson in science. You can't believe the dogma. And some scientists go so far as to say you can't believe anybody's experiments except your own. So there's all this stuff about the coronavirus right now, and it's controversial whether this is true or whether that's true or not. And I have a lot of just lay people asking me why is there so much controversy in this business? So I told them that. I said, I don't believe anything unless I do it or one of my good friends does it. So anyway, I'm getting off the track. And so we did the experiments, and the very first experiment worked. We were able to generate these cytotoxic T cells. We put them in Frankie's factor. They grew and they grew and they kept on growing, and we kept on taking aliquots out, testing them for cytotoxicity. They maintained their cytotoxicity. And so for all intents and purposes, we had proven the dogma wrong. And because I felt, not only did we make it to so that these would react to a specific antigen, which was the leukemia cells. They were the leukemia cells. They weren't just any old antigen like chicken gamma globulin or bovine serum albumin or something like that. They were to mouse leukemia cells. So I thought this was really important, and I sat down and wrote the paper, and we sent it off to Nature. Very short paper, only like 2 pages. And I got it right back the next week in the mail, rejected. And so I said to myself, these people don't understand. They don't understand what we're saying. And when you write a scientific paper, you have to, as I think I've said previously in one of the other videos, you got to make it concise, tightly integrated, and persuasive. But it's all in scientific acronyms and short words and stuff like that. And I figured that the editors it was too new. So I sat down and wrote them a letter. And it's back before email, so it had to go by snail mail. And so I wrote them another letter, and I, 1-pager, and I explained to them, what this was all about and why this was so important, and that they were missing out if they didn't send this thing out for review. So they agreed with me, and they sent it out, which was surprising. They sent it out for review, and the reviewers agreed with me, and so it was published in 1977 on July 14th. And of course, if you know anything about French history, you realize that was Bastille Day. That is Bastille Day, when the French celebrate the revolution. And I thought that was particularly promising, because I figured this was going to be a revolution for T cells. And so that's where we went. Now, even before that paper was published, I got another call from Frank. And this time Frank said, Gallo doesn't want to collaborate with you anymore. Doesn't want me to collaborate with you. And I said, why? And he said, because he doesn't want us to be working on T cells, lymphocytes. He wants us to be working on what we call AML cells, acute myelocytic leukemia cells, which is another leukemia from a white blood cell, but not a lymphocyte. He wants us to work on AML. He doesn't want us to work on T cells, and so he's given the whole project over to a guy by the name of Ron Herbermann at the NCI, who was an immunologist. So, you know, he said, "This is immunology. You guys deal with that. We're going to find the answer to cancer in my lab." And so that was sort of took the wind out of our sails, and I didn't really. I sort of let that roam around in my head for a few days or a few weeks even. But then I decided, all right, you know, this is really important, and we've got to whatever those guys are doing down there. I don't know what they're doing. I don't care what they're doing. This is what we're going to do. And so I knew, so we could grow these cells long term, but the problem was we needed to make our own, we had to become our own biotech company, making our own factor. And so we spent a lot of time just making factor and not much time, you know, doing too many experiments with our cells and so forth to characterize them and find out what they were doing. And I figured right away that we needed an assay for this factor because we're going to have to purify this growth factor and put it in a bottle, essentially. And so we had enough of it to do all the experiments that we wanted to do. And so the good news about an assay of this kind is that I'd already done one of those with Torg Fredrickson in France for EPO, Erythropoietin. There, the targets, so what you do is you put your factor into your culture plates, and then you add cells that will respond to that factor, and then you wait a little while, and then you monitor those cells for proliferation. There are various ways to do that. And so I'd already set up the prototypic assay for EPO, and we just did the same thing for T cell, what we then called T cell growth factor. We didn't call it Frankie's factor anymore. We thought we should, since they divorced us, we were going to divorce them. And it turns out that this was really a breakthrough for immunology and for the cytokine field, because prior to that time, people had been dabbling with these different factors and so forth, but they tried to assay for it, but they only assayed sort of all or none assays to see whether is it there or is it not there, plus or minus kind of thing. But obviously, if you're going to purify this stuff, and if you're going to get enough of it so that you can characterize the molecules or the molecule that was the basis of this activity, you're going to have to know how much you had in your culture plots. And so you needed a way to quantify this. And because I'd already been through interferon assays that are multiple serial dilutions to quantify virus or quantify interferon activity, and then quantify EPO, you know, this is like falling off a log. So we did that. And it was great. And we had we really did a very good job in that paper. We sent that off to the Journal of Immunology because I figured it was the immunologists are going to want to know about this paper. And fast forwarding ahead to the 2000s, they cited our paper that came out in 1978 in the JI on the TCGF assay was the second most cited paper in the first 100 years of the Journal of Immunology. So it gives you an idea how important that whole thing was to everybody. Yeah, I mean, that was just, then also at the same time, one of the reasons I was sort of a setup for this, in addition to all the other stuff that I told you about with interferon or whatever, and EPO. So Peter Medawar, in his book, Advice to a Young Scientist, said, you know, you can make a lot of headway on problems that are poorly characterized simply by quantifying how much have you got of whatever the thing is. And he made his whole career basically on quantifying skin graft rejection times you put a skin graft on an animal that's going to reject it. Some of them did it within, a week or so, and some of them took a month or 6 months, and they'd finally reject that graft. And the question was, why was that? And he essentially showed the world why that was. And I won't go into that. I'll get off track. But I took his lesson to heart on that score. So also about that time, after we developed the assay and we were moving along and we were trying to go to the next step, I decided that I'd better find out what Herbermann was doing, as he was down there in Bethesda working away, and I couldn't find out from Frank what Herbermann was doing, and I couldn't find out from Doris because they didn't know what he was doing, because they were just. And so I invited Herbermann to come up to Dartmouth and give a seminar, and he did. And I can't remember exactly what he talked about in his seminar, but again, we went off to the Hanover Inn for lunch afterwards, and Steve and I and Mary and Paul Baker and so forth, and Herbermann. So we were talking, or just chatting and so forth and so on. And one of the things he said was, we're having trouble repeating Doris Morgan's work in a human lymphocytes. And of course, that made us very pleased, although we couldn't smile, at lunch, because we weren't having any trouble, not with our mouse cells. In humans, the humans we did. It took us longer to get the thing all worked up. So anyway, he was having trouble. And then he asked us a very, very critical question. He said, well, I wonder if have you cloned your cells yet? And we said, no, we hadn't. And that's all. That's all we said. We didn't say anything else. So afterwards, I went back to the lab. And we sat down and had a meeting. And we said, looks like we better clone these things right away. So Paul Baker decided, he volunteered to take on this project. And there were basically only two techniques to clone cells at the time. He tried both of them. They both worked. One worked better than the other. And the first experiments worked, and it was just like the initial cells being generated. As long as you had your growth factor and you knew how much to put into the cultures, it worked fine, because the cells were dependent on the growth factor. So we went ahead and sent that paper off to Nature again, mid-1978. And we got that paper back rejected. So it wasn't always sugar and cream and, a bed of roses in this business that we were in. But again, I thought to myself, it's very strange. They just don't know what's going on here. And so I decided not to do the letter business again already. And I just sent it off to the JEM, the Journal of Experimental Medicine, and they took it right away. And it was published in January of 1979. And that created a huge explosion of interest in the immunologic community. Everybody wanted to have their special clone of T cells that were reactive to whoever's antigen they were interested in, and so forth and so on. And I can remember in 1980 at the International Immunology Congress that was in Paris, they had a workshop on cloned T cells the very last day of the meeting. Some obscure room way the hell off into the convention center someplace. It took me a while to find it. And I walked into the thing, and the place was packed to the gilly snickers with people. It was sky high. It was 4:00 in the afternoon on Friday. And that's one of the times I said to myself, whoa, seems like we get the big time here, So when all this was happening, I just wanted to say a couple of words about what was going on at home in my house and in abode and so forth. And what had happened, so we initially were in Lebanon, New Hampshire, which was just an adjacent town, and in the Lebanon School District, And Carrie, my oldest son, was not happy. He was struggling in this place. And Lynn was a former first grade school teacher, so she knew all about the first grade. And so she took it upon herself to go in and talk to the teacher and find out what was going on and so forth and so on. And she came back, and I don't want to bore you with all the details, but she basically decided that this teacher was bogus and that she was taking Carrie out of that school. So we found out we could pay tuition to get Carrie into the Hanover school district. And of course, Hanover, New Hampshire, there's only 5,000 residents, and then there's 5,000 students. It's a company town, and the company is an educational company, this college. And so all of the people that work at Dartmouth College and all the professors and all the other people, they're educators. And so their schools in the Hanover school district were top notch. And so we put Carrie into the first grade, and he was immediately transformed into a very happy person. This was a good thing. The other thing, the other thing we realized was we couldn't continue to do this forever, even though we were happy in our first home. Lynn looked around then and shopped around and found a really wonderful house in the Hanover school district that was really essentially almost in the center of town. It was only 2 blocks from the main street. It was on a one-way street that on the other side of the street was a big ravine that sort of gradually receded down into a brook. There was a tributary of the Connecticut River. It's called Mink Brook. And it was a nature preserve. The lady who had owned it when she bequeathed it to the town when she died, and so there was nothing could be built there, and it was like being in the forest essentially. And we had this big wraparound porch on this house, and we bought these swinging chairs. And I would sit out there in the evening after a long day and have my coffee after dinner and so forth, and think about my life and so forth. There was a tremendous breeze that would come across the valley towards our house all the time. And I just, I adored this house. The other thing about it was just inside the front door, there was a study. There was my study, and it was lined with cedar. So it was very unusual. It wasn't just knotty pine, it was cedar. It's like a cedar closet. And there was also a fireplace in this little study. So the bookcase on one side and a fireplace on the other side, and I had my desk in the middle. And I spent, the other thing I didn't tell you is that so we spent 20 years in that house. And I didn't know that was going to happen at the time, but when I got into my study and I sat there at my desk and I looked out over everything and I said, could I have a bigger house up on top of a hill in Vermont? Could I have a bigger car or more cars or whatever? And I said, yeah, I could probably work for that, but I don't need that. I've got all I need here. This is it. And so I was perfectly happy, and Lynn was perfectly happy because there was a big kitchen that she then renovated into a kitchen that she could teach cooking out of. And so within a year of our move, which I think was back in '76, she started the Parisian kitchen, and whereby she taught anybody in Hanover, the Upper Valley, who wanted to learn how to French cook, she would teach them. And she taught them Julia Child's methods that she had, she was like that movie Julia and Julie, where the young woman gets the cookbook and starts on page 1 and goes through, cooks everything in sequence all the way through the book. Lynn did exactly the same thing, maybe a decade earlier, but she didn't blog about it, and she didn't write a movie about it or anything. But that was her class. But once you teach something, it's just like the medical saying, watch one, do one, teach one. Once you teach something, you get it pretty well set in your head as to what are the important things that you have to tell people to do, and so forth and so on. And so she became very popular. She became widely known in Hanover as this wonderful young woman who teaches French cooking. And So then we were back in the lab then, after we got the family settled down and so forth. It seemed to me that what was going on, and there were some other experiments that I'll get into in the next chapter, but the experiments that it indicated that the antigen was important in immunology, but not the whole story. Antigen caused the initial cells to, initial single cell to begin to proliferate. But there was a molecular mechanism whereby antigen did that. When antigen bound to a cell, it made the cell make T cell growth factor and become responsive to the T cell growth factor, but it was the T cell growth factor that made the cells grow. And so we set up a series of experiments to show that. And Paul Baker decided to do these experiments, volunteered and so forth. And the idea was, well, if that's true, and if it's really the growth factor and not the initial antigen, we could activate the cells with antigen, wait for a while, wash out the antigen, and then keep on washing out the cells every day so that they couldn't accumulate any growth factor. Or conversely, we could add growth, flood the system with the growth factor. And so again, lo and behold, it was exactly the way we would have predicted it, and the growth factor was the one that was really the primary thing. So we wrote another paper. So basically, I was really writing fast and furious and all this time. We wrote another paper. We sent this one off to the JM, the Journal of Experimental Medicine, because I figured this was an extremely important paper. And I got that paper back. We got that paper back rejected. So this time, the editor, they had an editorial board of about a half a dozen editors, and each one of them would be the editor of the month, and he would sign all the letters that either accepting or rejecting or whatever. So it just so happened that the editor who signed our letter, was Henry Kunkel. Now, Henry Kunkel was, I think he was close to 60 or around there. And he was godlike. I mean, he was probably the most famous immunologist at the time in the world. And I knew him, everybody knew him, but I had never met him. But he was a very sort of Eastern establishment, Ivy League kind of a guy that would button-down collar and button down tie and so forth. But I said to myself, this is crazy. We're going to have to do something about this, because these people don't get it either, for Christ's sake. And so I called him up, because he signed the letter, right? So I called him up. I introduced myself, and I told him about our paper that had been rejected. And he said, well, he couldn't really remember exactly what was said. That they have these editorial meetings once a week down there, and they decide yes or no on these papers. He said, let me look up my notes. And so he went to the file cabinet, got to his desk. He looked up his notes. And he said, well, the comments were sort of wishy-washy, and one of the comments was, it's just another factor paper. And at that point, I just went ballistic. And I said, well, you don't understand. This is not just another factor. This is primary for the immune system, the immune response, and so forth. And if you miss this paper, you just don't get it. And so it looks to me like what I need to do is come down there and give you a seminar and explain it to you. Well, then to that, so I was very, very aggressive. And he then suddenly got very flustered, and he didn't want to. He wanted to get off the phone right away, which he did. So I felt better, but it didn't get our paper published. And so we sent it off to the JI, and it got published, and it was no problem, and so forth and so on. But and then later on, 2-3 months later, he called me up and invited me down. He was at the Rockefeller University in New York. He invited me down, and I gave a seminar, and we had lunch together with his postdoc, and so we became friends. So that was all good in the end. Who knew, you know? So the thing is, also, just about that same time that we got this rejection letter from the Rockefeller and the JM, I had to apply for a grant renewal because they'd only given me the grant because I was a young investigator and so forth for 3 years. And so that meant I had to start writing a grant after only 2 years. So I didn't think there was going to be any problem. I mean, we had so much stuff, there was a T-cell revolution. So I wrote the grant, but then about the same time that we were dealing with the Henry Kunkel and the JM, I got a letter from the NIH saying that the grant had been rejected. Well, if that was the case, we'd be dead in the water. We in the backwater of Dartmouth. So at that stage, we still had a little money left in the grant, so I took the money and I bought a plane ticket to Bethesda, and I flew down there and met with the program people. And the program people, they can't do anything about how the peer review group, does anything to your grant. But I wanted to understand, what the problem was, if I was going to fix it and write another renewal and so forth. And so we talked and chatted and so forth. And halfway through the conversation, I said to them, "So how do you play this game?" And they looked at me. There was 2 of them. They looked at me and they said, "This is not a game, Dr. Smith." Like I was the bright young man that I was. And but they went back then, and they went back to the bureaucratic aspect of the NIH, and they appealed our case, and they gave us not 3 years or 5 years. They didn't renew the whole thing, but they gave us an extension for 2 more years, and that was enough. And because by that time, now 4 or 5 years had gone by from the beginning, from the initial paper on Bastille Day, so that the immunological community knew what was going on, and they were inviting me. I was going all over the place and giving seminars and attending meetings and being on the plenary sessions and so forth and so on. So this was all good. And about this time, there was one more series of experiments that we did at the end of the 70s, because one of the reviewers of our TCGF assay papers said, "Well, how do you know this isn't just LAF?" I didn't know what LAF was. LAF stands for lymphocyte activating factor. So I said, "Well, I don't." LAF was known to be made at that stage by macrophages, not T cells. And we thought it was coming from T cells, but it could have been coming from macrophages because we'd already done experiments to show that if we took macrophages out, then we didn't get very much T cell growth factor at all. So it's entirely possible. So we did a series of experiments and with cloned T cell lymphoma cell lines that made T cell growth factor, and we made some LAF, and we added it into the assay, and lo and behold, what it did was that it made the cells make huge amounts of T cell growth factor. But when we put LAF in the TCGF assay, all the cells died. That's when we started saying that LAF was a joke in our laboratory, but it did cause the T cells, to then make T cell growth factor, so we could say, okay, this is what's going on. And we then collaborated with a couple of LAF macrophage experts, Joe Oppenheim at the NIH and Larry Lockman from MD Anderson. And they had very pure, the purest LAF that there was at the time. And we put those into our different assays and so forth. And so we published 2 papers about this, one in Nature and another one in the JEM, the Journal of Experimental Medicine. And essentially that was the raison d'etre for the interleukin nomenclature. And there was a famous meeting in Ermitting, Switzerland, on the shores of Lake Constant in 1970, summer of 1979, where we showed them all the people at that meeting all the data, and so they basically said, yeah, that's what's going on. So then there was a whole group of guys that wanted to change the name of LAF and TCGF. And so we stayed up late into the night drinking beer and discussing all these issues and so forth and so on. And ultimately, we essentially settled on a new name that we made up. It was interleukin, because one of the arguments was, if there's two of them, there's going to be many more. So why don't we just number them? And so that's what we did. And we started out with LAF because it worked before the TCGF. It was named interleukin 1, and because TCGF came second, it was interleukin 2. But that allowed all of our competitors, to never reference our initial papers when we talked about TCGF. They only referenced the letter to the editor that about 50 of us sent off to the Journal of Immunology saying that we'd all agreed upon this new nomenclature. So that was a bummer. It was another part of a political aspect of science that you don't anticipate. But in the end, it turns out it was good because now, in the 2020, there are 43 interleukins. So that's a lot of interleukins. And if there's that many interleukins, there's a raison d'etre for each one of those interleukin molecules. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been selected for in evolution or conserved. So the name of the game then for the next 3 decades has been, what's this interleukin? What's interleukin 19 all about? What is it? What does it do? How does it work? How is it different or similar to the other interleukins and so forth? So it's sort of like job security, if you happen to be an interleukin researcher. So that's it in terms of chapter 3. And so at the end of this time period between 1974 and 1980, we had hit the big time. We had become somebody up at Hanover, New Hampshire, and it was just exhilarating. I can't even begin to describe how I think we all felt. And I underwent my second metamorphosis as a consequence. Because before that, even though I said to myself, well, I ought to be able to make it here if I can make it anywhere, I didn't know whether I could really make it or not. I was sort of, biding my time. I was playing with my kids and interacting with my wife and playing golf in the evenings. Dartmouth had a really nice course that I could just walk on all by myself. But when this happened, when all these things happened and they all came down and they all worked and they all got published in really good places, I knew that this was my career. This was the rest of my life, essentially. And therefore, I better pay attention. And so I underwent my second metamorphosis from sort of a gentleman New England professor to a scientist who was on call 24/7. And so that all also had ramifications for the family that I'll talk about in subsequent chapters, but it was great. And so stay tuned for chapter 4, which will be next. Thank you.